All right, welcome everybody. We are super excited today because we have Wendy here from Utah Open Lands to teach us about how we can kind of channel our inner steward, how we can care for the beautiful land that surrounds us. So I'm gonna just read a little introduction about Wendy and her background with Utah Open Lands, and then we'll turn the time over to her. So Wendy has been with Utah Open Lands since its inception in 1990. Utah Open Lands is Utah's statewide land trust and has protected over 64,000 acres throughout the state. Utah Open Lands and Wendy have been recognized as a leader in conservation efforts in Utah. Wendy has served on various legislative task forces looking at agricultural, trail, and open space preservation. She also served as one of the founding board members of Envision Utah. Wendy was the vice chair of the North Fork Preservation Alliance, which became the Sundance Preserve at the Redford Center when it began in 1997, and has also served as an advisory board member for Vital Ground. In 2017, Wendy was awarded the American Society of Landscape Architects Merit Award, shortly after receiving the 2016 Park City Rotary's Professional Citizen of the Year. In 2014, Wendy gave the opening remarks at the Columbia Law School State Attorney General's Program Conservation Easement Conference. In 2011, Wendy received the Park City Board of Realtors Community Service Award, and in 2010, Wendy and Utah Open Lands received the Utah State University Botanical Center's Environmental Stewardship Award. Wendy currently serves on the boards of High Country News, the Sundance Nature Alliance, as well as local open space boards in an ex officio capacity. Wendy's essay, Accommodating, Managing, and Sustaining the Wild, can be found in the book Reimagining a Place for the Wild. We are super excited to have you here today, Wendy. I think we have a lot to learn from you. So if you're here as a county employee with Healthy Lifestyles, please check the chat. We're going to be sending a sign-in link so you can get your points for attending. And now we'll turn the time over to Wendy, and you'll go till about 12:50, if that's all right.
That sounds fantastic. I really
Perfect.
appreciate being here with all of you. Salt Lake County has been a tremendous partner with Utah Open Lands in open space preservation efforts throughout the county for many, many, many years. And of course, we were both involved in the very first open space bond that the county had that has resulted in some amazing projects. I'm going to talk about a few of them today, but places like Rose Canyon, and a lot of the open space that we associate with the Draper Corner Canyon area, which I'm sure most of you, if you participate in a healthy lifestyle, you've probably made it down to Corner Canyon at one point or another to mountain bike or to hike. You know, as I thought about what to talk about today, I'm going to share my screen in a moment. I just wanted to let you all know that from many directions, I think that Utah as a state is at a critical crossroads when we think about our quality of life. And our quality of life is really tied to the healthy lifestyle that we all get to enjoy here in the state of Utah. You guys are very aware, I'm sure, of the crises that are facing things like the Great Salt Lake and what that could potentially mean to our air quality. Other issues, which we'll get into with respect to recreation. Those are all things that affect us on a daily basis. And so what I hope to be able to do today is, one, to tell you how you can be part of the solution. Two, to also hopefully inspire you that we're doing a lot in the state of Utah, in Salt Lake County. Utah Open Lands, our partners, obviously the county as well. There's a lot of good progress being made. And amid all sorts of thoughts about climate change and the climate crisis that we're facing, there's a lot of reason to hope. And there's a lot of reason to realize that there's a lot of resilience that we can all have, both with respect to ourselves and also in the greater um, you know, planet itself. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully start this presentation. And hopefully this will start from the very beginning. Give me a moment. Okay, it's not starting from the beginning, so you'll see it in reverse to start with. Utah Open Lands actually was the state's first local land trust when we started in 1990. The primary tool that Utah Open Lands utilizes to protect such amazing landscapes as the one you see here, Castleton Tower, is what we call a conservation easement. And that enabling legislation had only passed 5 years prior to us as an organization starting here in the state of Utah. But one of the things that I always think is really, really interesting about our beginning as an organization is that when we started and we looked at the things that we wanted to ensure we could protect throughout the state of Utah, there was some hesitancy as to what this was all about. Why would you want to preserve this open space when here in the state, 84% of our land is public land? Well, that's true, but if you think about the places that we most enjoy, they are the places that are really close to home that, and oftentimes they aren't or weren't protected. And one of the critical reasons that we saw that it was important to start an organization like Utah Open Lands that was able to protect these open spaces, natural heritage, the wildlife habitat, the recreational opportunities, is the top 2 reasons that people come to the state of Utah, move to the state of Utah, visit it, stay here to raise their families, is its scenic beauty and its recreational opportunity. So we knew as an organization there was a lot that we had to accomplish. It's been 33 years. I like to tell people I started when I was 12, so it doesn't sound like I'm as old as I am. But we really accomplished a lot when you look at the 64,000 acres that we've protected throughout the state. And it represents 100 different properties. And those properties range from working with private landowners to working with state agencies like the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, or of course the county, Salt Lake County. And I want to pause here for a moment to say that sometimes there have been questions about, well, hey, if the county or a city or even the state owns a piece of property, why do we need an organization like Utah Open Lands? Or why do we even need a conservation easement? And I think one of the reasons for that is we all know that the political winds can change throughout our state. And sometimes we have economic downturns. And all of those can result in some rash decisions that we end up making. But a conservation easement and an organization like Utah Open Lands that is apart from that political process, our only mission, our only goal is the preservation of the well-being of these open spaces that we enjoy. We're able to ensure that these landscapes stand the test of time. And unfortunately, I've been involved in too many projects where I've seen that a legislative act can actually unprotect a piece of property that was critical, vital, even seen as a fundamental underpinning of an open space area. When you look at the various different projects, and Bridalveil Falls is in the back of this screen, Utah Open Lands has looked at doing. Bridalveil Falls is a good example of what I just talked about with respect to wanting to ensure that there's a conservation easement on the property. Bridalveil Falls, believe it or not, before there was a conservation easement placed on the property, it was actually in jeopardy of being sold off for private development. Today, because of our work with Utah County, it is permanently protected under a conservation easement, and it also received designation as the second state monument in the state of Utah. So when I talk about the critical crossroads that we're at with respect to Utah, I think it really does come down to stewardship. And Hannah introduced me in terms of helping you understand ways that you can challenge your inner steward. We all know that in 2020, the state saw an increase of over 300% of our use on our open spaces. This picture is during the planning phase of the work that we did at Bonanza Flat. If you're not familiar with Bonanza Flat, it is at the top of Big Cottonwood Canyon. It's what we like to call the heart of the central Wasatch. And it was a 1,500, it is a 1,500 acre piece of property that was in jeopardy of being developed into homes, gated community, heated driveways, an 18-hole golf course, and being closed off completely to the public. It includes 3 alpine lakes that are just absolutely stunning, but it is in danger of being loved to death. In fact, in 2021, we did a study of people that were hiking to Bloods Lake. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the hike to Bloods Lake. And what we were finding is not only had that seen a 1,000-fold increase in 2020 and 2021, but also that 67% of the folks that were going on a hike to Bloods Lake were getting out to hike in the outdoors for the first time. That's outstanding and scary at the same time. And so one of the things that we are really hoping that everybody can do is be good stewards when they're out on the land. And really, we're trying to ensure that our conservation leadership that we have as an organization, ensuring that these landscapes get protected, is translated to all of you who utilize these places. And I think it's important to understand that just because there's not a public trail on a piece of property doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have some intrinsic value. In fact, one of the things that I wrote about in my essay for managing and accommodating the wild was that there are these places that we do need to leave set aside for wildlife. Because I think we all are inspired when we glimpse a moose or a deer or an elk when we're out on a hike. And those animals need to have refuges that are set apart, that aren't overly loved or overly used by us as humans. And so as we go out and we protect these lands for multitude values, for their scenic value, their wildlife habitat and ecological values, their recreational values, or even just their heritage values, some of those won't be open to the public. And we hope that people can understand that making sure you have a freshly picked tomato that's local depends on some of these landscapes that aren't necessarily open to the public. And that when we're out on these places that do have sensitive wildlife habitat, that we are good stewards, that we're not just out there getting our gym membership in, so to speak, but that we're actually mindful of the place and to a certain extent the story behind the property. Stories like the Redford property and the Elk Meadows Preserve that actually is open to a certain extent to the public on a regular basis. But that was protected because of Robert Redford and his family's love of that particular area and what it meant to wildlife, and specifically the West Traverse elk herd. So that brings us to really why we're here today. And one of the things that Utah Open Lands has been working diligently on, which is really the education piece. There's a lot to understand when we think about our choices in the out of doors. Really our climate resilience, our carbon footprint really starts when we step out our back door and we decide where we're going to go for that day. And so one of the things that we've done is our Transit to Trails program up to Bonanza Flat, because that area is an area where a lot of people tend to go, and it's a fairly far distance from the Wasatch Front and even from the Park City area, which seems like the Park City is the landowner of that particular property. And so our Transit to Trails program, which we were able to fund in conjunction with Park City and the Central Wasatch Commission, as well as a private donor, actually provides a fee-free shuttle service that will take you concierge style to Bloods Lake or the Bonanza Flat trailhead. And then you can call the shuttle back up and it'll pick you up when you're done. It's been an incredible success. And it's one of the ways that
the West Valley ended up not getting the spot at the Red.
Sorry, missed that.
You're fine. I muted it. So
Okay.
you're good to keep going.
And so I think that is one of the things that I think is really important, that we think about every step of our journey when we go out and we recreate. The other element that we think is really important is to help people understand some of the other benefits that are occurring when we're protecting these different landscapes. And I'll give you two examples. Coming back to Bonanza Flat, again, which is a great recreation area for sure, but we don't have a ton of trails, and we've actually minimized the capacity of how many people can be there, both through parking and also through the trails that we've designated. The interesting thing about land conservation, when you think of, for example, climate change, is the fact that we are, through the protection of Bonanza Flat, we are saving 65 million gallons a year in water consumption that would have occurred had that landscape been developed. So in a very real way, every acre that Utah Open Lands is protecting is translating directly into that climate resilience. Another element along those lines with respect to the climate resilience is really what I like to say is really a fundamental hope for how we can actually help the environment bounce back. And that is through our careful stewardship on two of the properties that we protected back in the mid 2000s, so around 2009, 2010, 2011. We had protected lands that we knew had appropriate habitat for species like the Columbia spotted frog, which is a candidate species for endangered species listing, and for the bobolink, which is a songbird that is actually a species of greatest concern because it has been on sharp decline throughout the state of Utah. And we did not find any Columbia spotted frogs on the property, and we didn't find any bobolink on these two properties until this past couple of years. And in fact, this year I was out on one of the properties, and not only did we see a male bobolink, but we also found a nest with a young chick in it. And that to me shows us that if we are being good stewards, that we can have hope, that we can bring some of these species even back from the brink. And that I think is truly inspiring. But it only happens if we take care of ourselves and we take care of our planet. So how can you challenge your inner steward? Well, again, I think one of the things that is really, really important is to think about every step of your journey when you're going out to recreate. There's also ways to get involved and understand a little bit more about some of the amazing properties and their story. Places like Killian Canyon, which is part of the watershed of Immigration Creek that flows down to the Jordan, that then makes its way to the Great Salt Lake. And Killian Canyon is an amazing place that actually we began the protection of that particular piece of property back in 2008. And that was one of those properties. There was about 265 acres amid other properties that were both private and public, some owned by Salt Lake Public Utilities, some Forest Service. And this particular property, the 265 acres, we were able to work with Salt Lake County, who is now the owner of that 265 acres. We hold the conservation easement in partnership with Salt Lake City Public Utilities, who also put funding in. And we also got a generous contribution of $500,000. When I think about properties like that, and I think about people going out and recreating on them, to me, it's really important to honor some of those landowners that have participated in the process. In this instance, an individual named Tracy Burton and Tom Johnson, and then also to ensure that we honor the donation that was made by the private donor who really protected this piece of property, yes, in part for recreation, but in part because of the stunning geology that is up in this area and the ecological uniqueness. The most amazing part of this story is that Salt Lake County recently acquired another parcel at the base of Killian Canyon that will serve as a trailhead access. And together with the landowner who contributed about 40% of the value, and Salt Lake City, we actually acquired another 120 acres and then another 6 acres, really now making this entire Headwater Killian complex completely protected. The whole headwaters of this is now protected. And that second 120 acres, there is a trail that goes through there, but it is mainly a seed bank of native seeds that can be utilized to actually restore areas throughout the foothills in Salt Lake. So again, understanding how all of these properties have a broader story than maybe just the trail that you're going out to utilize that day. Another way that we feel it's really critical for people to be a good steward is really to volunteer on our restoration events. We've had several restoration events that we've done throughout the years. Many have been up at Bonanza Flat of late. And most recently, we did a volunteer event on the Salt Lake County Whedon Farmland Preserve. Now, I want to tell you a quick story about the Whedon Farmland Preserve, because to me, it is an example of what we owe past generations and how we need to pay it forward to the future generations. Gene Whedon was an individual who owned this particular piece of property. And he had worked this farm through the Depression. And when there were bread and sugar lines that miners were standing in during the Depression to get food, he would take his freshly picked produce and he would go to those lines and just give it away. And so as we worked through this, and this was back in 1997, we worked through the preservation of this property, which is about 62 acres. I talked to Gene about his inspiration. Why did he want to preserve this property? And he said, well, if you want to create community, give someone a freshly picked tomato. If you want to deal with gang problems, get kids out working the soil, get them back to nature. And I really always think of Gene as one of those individuals who challenged his inner steward on a regular basis. He cared so much about this particular property. And at the time that we were working to preserve his property, there were no open space bonds. In fact, the first open space bond in the state of Utah, which took place in Park City, was still about 2 years away from actually happening. And so Gene had actually been offered several $1 million to basically purchase this from a development perspective. And this entire Whedon Farmland Park would have been completely lost. And I said to Gene, I said, what are you going to say when the reporters say, why did you preserve this particular piece of property? And he said, well, Wendy, you can't eat money. And I think of that a lot, because I think that when you think about his vision and how he wanted to make sure that there was locally produced produce that the community could participate in. And when he thought about the fact that, yeah, he could make millions of dollars, but instead he actually donated the conservation easement. So basically gave up that value. And in fact, being a farmer, I can tell you that there weren't a lot of tax incentives that he got off of that huge donation that he made. But to him, what was most important was that this land remain a legacy for the next generation and the generation after that. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about really trying to understand the story. Sometimes we have a very usury relationship with these landscapes. Certainly, I think when the gyms were closed down during COVID, we saw a lot of people getting into the out of doors for the first time. But again, it was, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get exercise, which is incredibly important and is part of our healthy lifestyle. But imagine being mindful of the story of how this landscape was protected, the story of what this landscape meant generations ago. There's a piece of property that we protected, for example, along the Jordan River called the Galena Sumcani Preserve. That is one of those properties that was slated for protection. And in 2009, a legislative act almost torpedoed that preservation. But fortunately, we were able to protect it. That 250 acres that's along the Jordan River, down in the south part of the valley in the Draper area, is also home to a 3,000-year-old archaeological site, a village that shows that there are structures, and it also provided evidence of the first corn pollen found in the Salt Lake Valley. That was really an amazing discovery. And whether it meant that there was actual corn being cultivated in the Salt Lake Valley 1,500 years earlier than we thought, or whether that corn was transported, quite frankly, all the way from the Yucatan Peninsula, we don't for sure know. But had this landscape not been protected, the technologies that allowed us to understand what was going on at that time had not been developed, and we would never have known that had this property been developed. And again, the story about how the Galena Stone County Preserve is sacred to 7 tribes in the state of Utah, how the tribes fought to ensure that that landscape was protected. The fact that that particular landscape is also an area along the Jordan River where you routinely will see great American pelicans, avocets, and other birds that are migrating. Understanding what is below the surface, so to speak, understanding what a landscape represents can often give us a greater sense of what we've inherited and what we can pass on to the next generation, and even how we engage with the landscape. Coming back to the Gene and Dean Whedon Farmland Preserve, this property right now is home to community gardens through the Wasatch Community Garden Program, as well as home to refugees who are gardening on this property through the IRC organization. And they're able to connect to their community by being able to grow crops from their homeland. So this particular property provides such a rich resource for connection with one another that what we did recently in our solarization project was to bring together folks from the outdoor retailers, folks from Salt Lake County, folks from Draper, and other volunteers, and actually not using chemicals, not using herbicides. We are actually transitioning some of the cheatgrass and the noxious weeds on this property back into the native plants. So if you want to volunteer with Utah Open Lands, there are lots of opportunities to really get your hands dirty, as they say, and get involved in these sorts of projects. You know, I think there's so many things that we look at when we see these landscapes that are really, really critical to understand and to be a part of. And part of that is just understanding the dynamic of how, when we go out on a landscape, we are bringing sort of cumulative impacts from where we've been before. One of the issues on the Whedon property, as I mentioned, is these invasive species, the cheatgrass, noxious weeds. We hope that everybody, after they leave a particular property, they're brushing off their boots. They're making sure that they're not taking seeds, oftentimes invasive seeds, from one area to another. That's one way that you can help even prevent wildfires. Yeah, I know, it sounds like a stretch. But one of the reasons that invasive species and noxious weeds are really, really something we want to eradicate is because oftentimes these particular species, they've been designed to outcompete the native species. So that means they love to get into disturbed soil. They oftentimes germinate quickly. They get green quickly, and they immediately go brown, go dormant faster, so they can deal with the climate regime, the drought, lack of water. They're outcompeting these other species, but you can imagine that once they've turned brown, they become a great fire hazard. Another thing to think about when you're out in the great outdoors is to think about just the interrelation of these different ecological regimes that we have, to understand the forest complex and the forest dynamics. I'm sure a lot of folks are very familiar with the bark beetle, for example. And that has been a huge, huge problem in the West, especially as our temperatures rise. Part of the reason for that is the cold winters oftentimes would set the bark beetle and the bark beetle larvae back by basically freezing them. But as the temperature has climbed, we're not getting that kill off of the larvae, and they have just exploded. Well, one of the greatest things that we've been able to do, looking at some strategies, is one, we've had volunteers who've gone out and been able to place pheromone packets to help protect stands of conifers, but also working with some of our partners, help to keep a mid-successional forest state by encouraging aspen regeneration and recruitment in some of these areas that we have amazing landscapes. And we found on one of these properties, actually up in the Summit County area, along the Mirror Lake Highway, actually, that particular area, the aspen forest was able to halt a forest fire that had started in a conifer portion of the property long enough so that firefighters could get it under control. Because aspens are a water-loving tree in a desert. And so they're amazing, but because we can't allow forest fires and because natural succession practices aren't always allowed to happen, we have to kind of aid this aspen forest recruitment and regeneration. Another issue that we see there is obviously there's a lot of large ungulates, primarily elk, that really love to feast on aspen forests. And without having an apex predator like a wolf, it is really hard to ensure sustaining some of our aspen forests. So I bring all of these forward not to geek out on aspen forests or the ecology of these, but to again reiterate that idea that there's so much more of the story in a landscape than we might be aware of. And what we're really hoping as we challenge folks to challenge their inner steward is to maybe look at the landscape from the landscape perspective. What's going on with the landscape? And really appreciate, nature for nature's sake, as corny as that might sound. Because what we're seeing in this rapid increase in recreation is that we don't have as much land as we have interest in recreation. So if you've been to a trailhead recently and it's been completely full and it's your favorite spot, or if you've been on a trail and you feel like you're in a lineup for a Disneyland ride, part of that is because the recreational opportunities are not keeping pace with the recreational demand. And so we encourage people, maybe don't always go to your favorite spot, but quite frankly, also encourage your elected leaders, the legislature, and others to put more funding and more resources into open space protection because it helps the wildlife habitat, obviously, but also it will help with the demand that we're seeing in this increased recreation. And I guess I'll take a chapter 2 out of our friends at the Mountain Trails Foundation. The executive director of Mountain Trails Foundation, Charlie Sturgis, often talks about the best thing you can do out on the trail is to practice 10 minutes of kindness. Between e-bikes and hiking and multiple use trails and trail users coming into conflict, really 10 minutes of kindness with each other when we're out on the trails can really, really go a long way. I think one of the main things that we look at Utah Open Lands is we really can't do this without you. We can't do this without your voices, without contributions to the organization. We are a private nonprofit organization. We're not funded by the state. We're not funded by the county. We get our funds from the members who believe in what we do. And I can tell you, we've done the numbers, and with the multiple millions of dollars of land that we've protected, every dollar that comes into this organization translates into acres preserved. And so however you want to get involved, if you want to volunteer for the organization, we have a number of events that you can get involved with and participate with. You can look at our Conservation Ambassador program that we have. We encourage people to help us get the word out to those who are using the trails. Sometimes trail etiquette is not necessarily that people want to be bad trail users. They might just not know. So oftentimes peer-to-peer nudges where you're just simply suggesting, hey, you do need to pick up your doggy waste bag. I got to tell you, when we were working on the Bonanza Flat trails and the management plan for Bonanza Flat, I had never before in my entire career GPSed every single doggy bag of dog waste on a trail. But I did for Bloods Lake, and it was pretty eye-opening. Only 3 weeks after the trail opened, we found one almost every 500 feet along the trail. Those sorts of things have a cumulative impact. And I think that oftentimes it's not necessarily people wanting to, have bad behavior per se, but oftentimes it is people just not knowing that this is a cumulative impact. So that's one of the ways you can get involved. And again, really, I think that if you just even get involved in receiving information from Utah Open Lands, we can help you know when trails at Bonanza Flat or trails in other areas are closed due to wildlife concerns. Maybe it's a calving season. Maybe it's the rut and there are some specific issues. Maybe there's some trail restoration work that is going on. Maybe there are some parts of the season where it's just become overloaded. We can provide you with that information. We have landscape landing pages for properties like Castleton Tower, which Castleton Tower is a fee campground. And that is actually something that is loved down in the Moab area. But we need people to be good stewards, and we can't allow that campground to get overloaded. So if you can know by going to these landscape landing pages before you go out on one of these places, for Bonanza Flat, for example, we actually have trailhead cams. And again, there's upcoming events that we have to get involved in all the way through September 13th. We have our big Portraits of Preservation Gala that is going to help us with the good work that we're doing to preserve multiple landscapes throughout Utah. And with that, I think what I will do is I will stop sharing, if I can figure out how to stop sharing. No, that's not it.
It should just be a bar at the top of your screen. I don't know if you see it anywhere.
Ah, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. I don't know. Did that stop sharing? I pressed the stop share.
Yes, it stopped sharing.
Great.
You're good.
So, I think obviously one of the things that to me is really, really critical when you look at the protection of these open spaces is that your voice really does matter. And as much as I talk about the stories of the landscape, at Utah Open Lands, we would love to hear your story. We'd love to get photos of great places that you've been out and enjoyed, and to be able to share that with others. I think that we will continue to be challenged as a state with how to manage the increase in the recreation use. And that's where I think it's really important for everybody to get engaged, to let, again, not only your elected leaders, but also to talk about it within your individual peer groups about what you'd really like to see as the quality of life for the state of Utah. We are at a tipping point in a lot of ways, whether you're looking at water resources for the Great Salt Lake, or you're looking at traffic congestion going up through our canyons. There are a lot of solutions that I think we can get to if we can come together and if we make this a top priority. And the reason that I suggest it's a top priority, even though I know there are many, many, many other issues that we're all concerned about. They're not making more land. We kind of get one chance at this. And as a former governor said, if we screw it up, this one chance that we have, future generations are going to judge us harshly, and they should. We've inherited a lot. When you think about the first people, we're not necessarily the settlers, right? In this particular area, there is a land ethic. There is a conservation ethic that we need to embrace. And it is the job of each one of us to look at the landscape from that landscape perspective, look at it from the eyes of the generations to come. And there's actually, again, I think a lot of resilience in that. I think it's a very grateful way to engage with the landscape and to ensure that when you go out, you're thinking about all of those different ways you can reduce your carbon footprint, you can reduce your footprint itself on the landscape. And as I have said to people in the past, yeah, it's really cool to see some big wildlife, out on the trail. And sometimes if a moose is standing right there in the way, that means you need to turn around and end your hike there. So it's a lot about being respectful of each other, but really respectful of that larger sense of community, the ecosystems, the various different species that inhabit that area. I love dogs. I have a dog myself. I also have horses, but there are definitely trails and places that I would not take my horse because they would be too tough on the trails. And as much as I love to have my dog off leash, I think a lot of times we don't think of how a dog off leash actually does have an impact on some of the micro ecosystem, the little creatures, the snakes, and all of those creatures have a huge, huge role to play. They have their own job in that ecosystem. And to the extent that we diminish their ability to have refuge in these areas, we've altered that landscape. We're not going to be able to be perfect. I understand that. And we want to be able to enjoy our time outside. But I think that a step with gratitude when we're out there to each other, to the landscape itself, it's actually going to go a long way as we work through the challenges of how we manage recreation and how we sustain these incredible ecological resources that we have on our open landscapes throughout the state. So with that, I know I'm a little bit short. We have about, 15 minutes for questions and answers. I'm sure that there are many questions, but why don't we open it up for questions and answers?
Feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can type it in the chat and I'll read it out for you.
So I have a question that maybe people could answer. And that is, tell me if you have a favorite experience that you had in the outdoors that doesn't have to be life-changing, but that really changed your perspective on living in the state of Utah. Come on, somebody's got to have a fun experience. I saw one question. Go ahead.
Will you say that again? I'm sorry, it cut out a little bit on my end.
Oh, I was saying if you've had a great experience in the outdoors, not necessarily life-changing, but that maybe changed your perspective about living here in the state of Utah or the Salt Lake Valley. Maybe you could share that with us.
For sure. I mean, just in general, I feel like Utah is a big camping state. And so I grew up tent camping and trailer camping and all of that stuff, which was phenomenal. I absolutely loved that. And I, have carried that on as we've went with extended family and no longer do that. And then, just my own little family. I definitely feel like that has taught me to respect the outdoors a lot. After every camping trip we would go down, or after everything's packed up, we would make sure that we leave the campsite just exactly as we found it, right? So my mom would always, when we were littler, she would save popsicles for the very end of the camping trip, and we would go around and race to find as much trash or garbage or whatever that wasn't there before we'd put it in a garbage bag and then collect our popsicle at the end. And so that definitely taught me a little bit more about like, hey, this is important that we leave it as we found it in the beginning, because then, you know, I want to be able to have these opportunities when I have my own family and my kids can run around picking up trash and giving them popsicles, you know. So that's that's a big one that definitely changed my perspective. And then the other, I mean, I have so many, but the other one is we have a walking and hiking group with our county employees. And um, we went on a particular hike last year. It was fall, and we went up Bell's Canyon, and the colors were so phenomenal, and the air was so delicious. Like, and the colors and the water and everything, it was just so pristine. Um, and it's so crazy that we had that like right at our back door. I am so in love with Utah and so grateful for the opportunity that I can drive not even a half hour and enjoy green space. You know, it's so wonderful.
Awesome. Do we have some questions?
Yeah. So there's some comments in the chat, Hannah.
I can read them out. Let me go through them. Maureen said, a great experience in the outdoors is literally every time I go outside, with a
Nice.
winky face. And then we have a question from Kirsten. She said, do you have an outdoor experience that changed your perspective about living in Utah? Oh, yeah. I guess that's the question you asked, but you can share your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I have many, like so many of you. But I think one of the ones that was just kind of a phenomenal experience, and Allie Arrow, who's on with us, and she's the director of our community engagement for the organization. But when she was younger, much younger, she and her family were involved in a protection effort that we were doing for Toll Canyon up in the Park City area, and we were trying to raise $250,000 in 5 weeks to finalize this campaign. And we had brought a park record reporter out to the site. I was actually with Allie's dad, and trying to get her excited about how meaningful it would be to preserve this property. Like we really had to understand it. And we got out of the car, and literally 10 feet in front of us, a huge bull moose was walking down the slope. There was snow lightly falling. It was like 3 days before Christmas or something, and just walked right across in front of us. And as inspiring as that is, to see a moose that close, to have it timed in that way, the park record reporter was seeing a moose in the wild for the very first time. And we got a great story. And I mentioned that one because I think that there are moments that we have like that in the out of doors where we see ourselves as part of a greater whole, and it kind of feels like the universe is working with us and not against us. And I think that was just such a phenomenal moment for me. I saw somebody said something about if you're hiking and you see evidence of bark beetle, should you report it? If you can get a picture, and if it's on a Utah Open Lands piece, and you can get a GPS point, that's great. Sometimes what looks like bark beetle is actually another parasite. It's a plant parasite called mistletoe, but we can always check out those sorts of things. There's a lot of inventorying that's being done on bark beetles in general. So you don't necessarily have to do it, but if you happen to snap a picture and get a GPS point, send it along. Yeah.
Love that. Melody said, I've seen 3 moose while hiking. Each time was breathtaking. It's a
Nice.
similar experience. And then Benton said, I grew up in Moab. I really appreciate everything your organization does and has done. Growing up, we spent a ton of time outdoors, and appreciation and respect of the outdoors was taught to all of us. I love the beauty of our state. I miss my hometown a lot. I really miss the beautiful red rocks.
Yep. Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah. And then Brittany said, grew up having my dad always tell us, don't bust the crust. Stay on the dedicated trails and don't veer off because you don't know what you are harming. I love that.
Yes. Please, please do not create your rogue trails.
And then Ryan said, one of the most amazing experiences I had in the outdoors was seeing the night sky at Bryce Canyon years ago. No moon, clear sky, and hardly anyone at the lookout point. You will never see more stars, and if you haven't done that at Bryce, I highly recommend it. Wow.
It's awesome. We also, if you go to our website, we've just put up our annual report, and we also have links to our landscape landing page and also to our Leave It Loved campaign. That's one of the things we're trying to encourage folks. Unfortunately, these days, you may have to pick up your neighbor's trash. And so we're trying to encourage people to actually even go beyond the leave no trace, but help us do a good job with that. And I think the other thing that I was surprised actually just recently, this past weekend, I did a river trip and there were various different places to camp along the river, and somebody had not put out their campfire. And it always blows me away, in the wildfire west, that some of those things need to be reminded. But I think if we can do it with patience and we can do it with kindness, it is really important. We're going to be those voices that help other people understand things like, yeah, no, you shouldn't be having a campfire, and definitely should not leave it smoldering. But in that particular instance, yeah, we put it out. So those are the kinds of things that, from Utah Open Lands perspective, we think that the shift in understanding. It sounds like all of you guys have had good parents and good experiences in the out of doors that have been your teachers, to make you the kinds of stewards that you are. So we appreciate that, and we really do hope that you encourage others to be good stewards as well. It's going to be critical as we move forward. I mean, what is Salt Lake City's population is expected to double by 2025? That's 2 years away. It's a lot more people. So we need everybody's voice. We need everybody's help in trying to really manage the situation. And those of you that understand the good ethics of being outdoors, share and share often.
Oh, thank you so much, Wendy. It's been so wonderful to listen to you speak today. I feel like I learned so much. Something that really stuck out to me, you talked a lot about places I've loved to recreate growing up, like Corner Canyon or Bloods Lake. I have a lot of like really fond memories at Bloods Lake. But I've never gone to these areas and been mindful about the story or the history or like the animals around me. I haven't stopped to think about that and to connect. So I'm excited to take kind of that advice and to start being more mindful about the history and the love that these areas have had for years as I continue recreating there. So I loved it.
Awesome. Then I have one homework assignment for everybody that's on this. And I think
Okay.
it'll be fun. The next time you go out for a hike, find a place and a moment to just sit down with a journal and just write what you see, write what you feel, write what you're thinking. I think you'll find that helps you engage in that mindfulness. Like, what are the questions you have? Like, what is that outcropping of rock up there? Because finding out the answers to some of those things just enrich your experience so much more. So that's my homework assignment for you all.
Ugh, I love that. I can't wait to do it.
Okay. Awesome. Send them to us. We'd love to hear them.
Well, thank you so much. Does anyone else have any more questions or any comments to make?
This was fabulous. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Absolutely.
Okay, you're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. So
Thank you. I really appreciate everybody's participation today. It boosts our morale that people care and they want to be a part of this. So thank you.
Wonderful. We'll send the sign in link again in the chat. So if you're here with Healthy Lifestyles, please sign in to get your points. And thank you once again, Wendy. This was amazing.
All right. We'll see you out there on the trails.
Bye.
Bye.